Okay, do we have any questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Richard Roth, Capital District Alliance for Universal Healthcare. Going back to your early slides on Social Security and Medicare. Incidentally, I learned last night that Paul Ryan saved up his Social Security money in order to go to college when his father died at the age of, he was 14. So I'm sure he's interested in keeping Social Security around. But if you go to the Strengthened Social Security website with Professor Eric Kingson at Syracuse, there is relatively minor adjustments that have to be made to have Social Security last a long, long time. But I don't know the influence of demographics on that. The other website to see how we could make a better and much more efficient healthcare system would be pnhp.org, Physicians for National Health Program, with the work of Himmelstein and Woolhammer, and also the Lewis Group in their studies of California, which indicated that a single payer improved Medicare for all would generate $400 billion in savings, enough to take care of the uninsured.
All very, very interesting points. Let me start with Social Security, and then move on to the $64 trillion healthcare question. Social Security is U.S. Social Security is not a terribly expensive or generous social insurance system, state pension system, certainly by developed country standards. It's projected to grow from about 4.5% to about 6.5% of GDP over the next 30 years as boomers retire. So that's not a huge run-up as a share of the economy. I would point out that the various proposals which purport to sort of balance the Social Security system over the next 75 years with really quite minimal adjustments on the revenue or the spending side. These are actuarial projections that assume that the accumulating Social Security trust fund actually constitutes economic savings. In fact, the trust fund does constitute legal budget authority for Social Security. It's a claim on Treasury, but redeeming the trust fund will require raising taxes, cutting other spending, or borrowing from the public. So if you look at Social Security from a unified budget perspective, the challenge is somewhat greater, nonetheless manageable. Part of the problem is, indeed, that the healthcare side is growing so rapidly. Now, a lot of people look at that and they say, well, healthcare is growing a lot more rapidly. That's where 80-90% of the projected growth in entitlement spending is. Therefore, Social Security isn't a problem. But Social Security is not its own, republic. And money is fungible. So to the extent that healthcare spending is more difficult to control, that makes perhaps cost-saving reform in Social Security more, not less, urgent. So that's one point. On the healthcare side, yes, national health systems spend a lot less, per capita, and they cover the entire population while doing that. But I think there's a fundamental dishonesty, frankly, on both sides in the healthcare debate. The way they do that is by imposing a budget constraint and rationing access to technology. That may be what we need to do. You can make an argument that a national health system is more efficient and more, well, you could make an argument that it's more equitable. With somewhat more difficulty, you could make the argument that it's more efficient. But you can't make the argument that it gives more for less, in my view. And very thoughtful scholars, hardly on the right of the political spectrum, like Henry Arrett at the Brookings Institution, or the late William Schwartz, long argued that controlling healthcare costs in the long run requires a decision not to pay for some care that would be beneficial to some people. And I think that's the step in the debate that neither side is willing to take yet. So I don't think there are any simple solutions there.
Okay. Bob?
Thank you both. Bob Ward, thank you both for the presentations. I could ask a number of questions, but Richard, let me focus on the numbers you showed about life expectancy having gone up essentially by 10 years in this country over the last 50 or so years. What does that suggest for retirement age in Social Security and other retirement programs?
Well, in fact, here's an interesting way to get into to respond to the question. If we had indexed Social Security, the Social Security retirement age, to life expectancy, in other words, kept the proportion of one's adult life spent working and spent in retirement unchanged, since the system was founded, the Social Security retirement age would now be 73. Okay, we have a reform working its way through the pipeline which will raise it to 67. I think that at a minimum, we need to, going forward, raise the full benefit retirement age in tandem with the increase in life expectancy, while being aware and making provision for the fact that some people who don't have the good fortune to work in the kinds of jobs that we do may find it difficult to find jobs at older ages or to simply to perform them. So I think we may need to strengthen disability and as we do that, but absolutely need to tap into the productive potential of the elderly, raise retirement ages, and extend work lives as we do that.
Another question. I guess at the other end of the population generator, population process, it's interesting that that the U.S. Fertility rate is so high. I assume you suggested that it has something to do with the immigrant population, or perhaps recent immigrant families. But in some ways, it's counterintuitive according to some ways of thinking about it, because in some ways it's costly economically to have children in the United States, with less child care, less, especially by comparison to European countries, where we have more costly child care, we have fewer maternity benefits, leaves, even paternity benefits, college costs are higher here, etc. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what's known about the reasons for the U.S. fertility rate being so high by comparison, or why France is higher higher than the other countries in
Sure.
the European area.
Sure. First of all, immigration, and in particular higher Hispanic fertility, is a part of the story. If we were to, if we factor out the Hispanic and look only at the non-Hispanic, we would have a 1.9 instead of a 2.1 fertility rate. But still, 1.9 is at the very high end of the developed world, even so. So what are the reasons? Well, there are. I think maybe the most interesting point is that it's flexible labor markets, and this will. I'll bring in France here in just a second. I'll bet you most people in this room assume that more working women means fewer babies, right? That the correlation between female labor force participation and the fertility rate is negative. The more working women, the fewer babies. This was true until the mid-'80s, but that correlation has reversed. And in fact, it's the countries in the developed world, and also in emerging East Asia, it's the countries with the highest fertility rates that have the highest female labor force participation rates. So what's going on? What's going on is it's the countries that, for whatever reason and through whatever means, make it easier for young families, and particularly women, to balance jobs and babies, get more of both. And those countries that don't get less of both. So you have, in Italy or a South Korea or a Japan with low female labor force participation and low fertility, the aspirations of women have changed there too. They're highly educated younger generations, yet there's a family and a workplace culture that makes no allowance. Now in the United States, we make this allowance through more flexible labor markets, opportunities for re-education and training. It's easier to exit and re-enter. I know, maybe not always at the same level, but in other countries it's impossible. Then you have the French or the Scandinavian model, in which this is accomplished through generous government subsidies for daycare, etc., free at point of purchase, and also government mandates in the labor market for paid maternity and paternity leave. In Sweden, that actually, if the woman takes the maternity leave, then for a first child, then the husband has to take it for the second. There's a comprehensive system of pronatal incentives, and so that is an important part of it. And the one other factor is religiosity, because fertility is positively correlated, and strongly so, with degree of religious conviction. And even within the United States, the fertility rate in blue zone Vermont is 50%. I believe it's a 50% differential, or close to it, between blue zone Vermont and red zone Utah, which are the two outliers, down around 1.6 versus 2.5.
So many ways to have a baby. Yes, sir.
Neil Lane. Richard, this is for you. And it picks up on income adequacy in a bit of slide on as the 85-year-old gets older, their income is substantially less than a 75 or a 65-year-old. So if we look at changing the age rate in Social Security, there's another population that is very much disadvantaged by that, other than the, if you will, the blue-collar worker for showing that is widows. Widows are substantially disadvantaged if you raise the Social Security retirement age. But to the other debate that's going on is this notion of at some point at 80 or 82 there needs to be a bonus or a bump in the Social Security because of their income at that point is inadequate for a decent quality of life. Comments?
You raise an extremely important point. And I think part of the solution really has to be a redefinition of old age. A friend and colleague of mine at the Urban Institute, Gene Sterling, says that, likes to point out that most of what we're doing with our entitlement programs today, that a very significant share of this money is really subsidizing early retirement for people in late middle age. That the 60s is no longer old age. And part of what we need to do, and yes, I mean, there is incomes are lower at the older ages. There's a feminization of poverty among the elderly because of differential mortality. We need to retarget the dollars we spend. It's not necessarily that we need to spend less, it's that we need to target it better. And you could even improve the adequacy outcomes if you were able to sort of muster a political consensus around it.
Yes.
Joel Margolis, private citizen. I'll just make two real quick points. One, you omitted the most likely way we're going to solve the problem, and that's to inflate the currency, which is usually the way these kinds of problems are solved. Now, that's at cross purposes with borrowing money, but if you don't inflate it at a very high rate, it's the simplest thing. And the other thing, in terms of you're not going to be able to punch above its weight in 30 or 40 years, if you just look at Libya today and ask yourself 40 years ago, 50 years ago, England and France, two members of the Security Council, presumably incredibly powerful countries, are unable to deal with Libya, not one of the strongest nations in the world in terms of military force, but just simply because their social welfare expenditures are so high that their militaries have literally collapsed in terms of expenditures.
Well, the second point, I think, makes my point. And as for the inflation, actually, that really wouldn't work. Why? Because our entitlement programs are directly or indirectly indexed to inflation.
But that's only today.
Well,
Okay, we should finish up, so let's have some quick questions and quick answers for the remaining. Way in the back.
Dr. Jackson, I wonder if there are factors at play that could shift actually shift globalization back to localization, or is globalization here to stay?
Well, I think given the changing demographic profile, given the demographic trends in the rich world, we ought to hope that it's here to stay, because we are, in a rapidly aging society with a slowly growing workforce. The rate of return to capital is going to fall over time. Let's hope, that we can invest our savings in younger and faster growing countries. Let's hope that we can leverage surplus labor in younger and faster growing countries and match jobs and workers. So I would be even more concerned than I am to see if we were to see globalization roll back.
And I was just wondering if globalization depends on cheap oil, or
Why don't we go to another? We have to
Okay.
finish up. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'll make this a quick question for you then.
Thank you.
You mentioned that as we age, our productivity tends to diminish. Yet we're indicating that we should work longer now. At least this proposal that we work longer even though our productivity tends to be reduced. Do you project that we have a growing labor force that will be able to, a growing job market that will be able to provide jobs to our young folks as well as an increasingly aging population?
Well, don't have the kind of dynamic general equilibrium model that you could construct a model that might pretend at least to answer that question. I think the main point is that an older worker is better than no worker, and indeed older workers do bring some important qualities to the table. Many studies have been done that show that they're more reliable, they're better on customer service. Older workers do have certain advantages, even if in all ways they're not perfect substitutes for younger workers. And yes, I think that if we make sure that public policy doesn't get in the way, that there will be jobs there. At least I hope they will. You might, one of the remarkable things about the current downturn is that the unemployment rate, and this I believe has never happened before, is actually lower for older workers than for younger workers. That's the reverse of the usual historical pattern.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Will it be the last?
Thank you. Just a comment and a question. We are already matching younger workers with jobs. That's called outsourcing. The question is, we work for the Assembly, and I know that state government doesn't do very much, so this will be very short answers. But do you have any recommendations for state government?
Oh, right. Let me turn this one over very quickly.
For state government coping with current recommendations for state government to do what? Survive the crisis? Survive aging?
Surviving economically.
Surviving economically. The state clearly has to grapple with some huge issues. So no question about that. The focus on public employment, I don't think is sufficient. Having just exited as a public employee and being one of those great pensioners, I hope they don't deal with it in that. New York, unfortunately, and in my position as a demographer, I think it's one aspect that the state never really grappled with and understood, or maybe wanted to understand. What's happening isn't new. It's not a new story. It's not something that demographers weren't talking about 20, 30 years ago. Yet the state seems to be unable to grapple with some of this. I was almost heartened, and this will sound sort of strange, in the first year of the Spitzer administration. One of the things that became a policy focus was brain drain, the loss of that younger portion of the population in the state. And I was heartened because for the first time in the 30 years that I worked for New York State, somebody paid attention to it. I think there's still struggles to get to pay attention to the right things that have policy implications for getting the state on the right track. It's a different competitive environment for the state. Without huge pools of population and economic growth to draw on, we're competing with states that we never had to compete with before. It's a very different economic environment.
Well, thank you very much.